That can't be right. Oh my God.
Tanya Ellison sat in the driver's seat of her car outside a gas station at 11 at night, for children asleep behind her under a pile of blankets, a $2 scratch ticket trembling in her hands as she checked the numbers against her phone screen for the third time, certain she'd misread something. 6 weeks earlier, she'd packed everything that would fit into this car and driven away from the only home her kids had ever known, unwilling to keep them one more night in a house where their father's temper and disappearing rent money had made safety feel like something she could no longer guarantee. Now the numbers on her phone matched the numbers on the ticket in her hand, and Tanya sat perfectly still in the driver's seat, unable to make a single sound, afraid that speaking the truth out loud might somehow make it stop being true. What does a mother do the moment everything changes while her children sleep 3 feet behind her, unaware their entire lives just shifted? How does a woman rebuild after 6 weeks of living out of a car with 4 kids? And when the same man who put her there shows up months later, dressed nice and asking for a second chance the moment he learns what she won, what does she actually owe him? Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand how Tanya ended up in that gas station parking lot, you have to go back nearly 9 years, to a marriage that started with real hope and slowly wore that hope down to almost nothing. Tanya married Corwin Ellison when she was 23, both of them young and optimistic in the specific way people are before life has tested them much. Corwin working steadily at a warehouse job that paid enough, in those early years, to cover a modest apartment and the beginnings of a family. Their first child, Devontae, arrived within the first year of marriage, followed over the next 6 years by Kayla, then Micah, then finally baby Journey. For children Tanya loved fiercely even as the marriage around them grew increasingly unstable beneath her. Those early years held real happiness alongside the hardship. Tanya recalled later, weekend cookouts with extended family, Corwin teaching Devontae to ride a bike in the parking lot outside their first apartment, small ordinary moments that made the marriage feel, for a long time, worth the effort she poured into it. She remembered specifically the pride Corwin took in providing for the family during his steadier stretches of employment, a version of him she held on to for years even as that version appeared less and less frequently. Corwin's struggles started gradually, a pattern of losing jobs every year or two, sometimes through layoffs beyond his control, more often through conflicts with supervisors or simple unreliability that Tanya watched develop with a growing, helpless frustration. Each job loss chipped away at whatever financial stability the family had managed to build, and Corwin's response to the mounting pressure increasingly took the form of a temper that frightened Tanya more with each passing year, raised voices that occasionally escalated into slammed doors and thrown objects, never quite crossing into something Tanya could point to as clearly, legally dangerous, but enough that she found herself flinching at sounds she never used to notice. The financial instability deepened considerably during the 2 years before Tanya finally left, Corwin cycling through 3 different jobs in that stretch alone, each departure accompanied by a story that shifted slightly depending on who was asking, and increasingly difficult for Tanya to fully believe. She took on extra shifts at the diner where she worked as a server, stretching her own income to cover gaps Corwin's employment history left behind, watching her savings account, modest as it already was, shrink steadily no matter how many additional hours she picked up. The final break came on an ordinary Tuesday evening when Tanya discovered, going through the mail, that their rent hadn't been paid in 2 months despite Corwin repeatedly assuring her he'd handled it. The money instead apparently spent on something Corwin refused to explain clearly even when she pressed him directly, offering only vague, shifting answers that told her everything she needed to know without actually answering anything. The argument that followed was the worst of their marriage, loud enough that a neighbor eventually knocked to check if everyone was all right, and Tanya spent that entire night awake afterward, understanding with a clarity that felt almost peaceful compared to the chaos around her, that she couldn't keep her children in that apartment, in that marriage, any longer. She packed the car 3 days later while Corwin was at what he claimed was a job interview, taking only what fit reasonably into the trunk and back seat, clothes, a few toys the younger kids couldn't sleep without, important documents she'd quietly gathered over the preceding weeks once she'd made her decision. She left before he returned, driving without a clear destination beyond simply away, understanding only that staying had become more dangerous, in every sense that mattered, than leaving with nowhere solid to land. The 6 weeks that followed tested Tanya in ways she still finds difficult to fully describe even now. She found a rhythm of sorts, parking overnight in well-lit gas station lots or occasionally a large retail parking lot she'd read online, was generally tolerant of overnight sleepers, waking before dawn to get all 4 kids washed up and dressed using gas station bathrooms before driving them to school, maintaining an exhausting daily performance of normalcy so none of their teachers or friends would suspect anything was wrong at home. The logistics alone consumed most of her mental energy during those weeks, mapping out which gas stations had the cleanest bathrooms, which parking lots felt safest after dark, how to keep the car's gas tank full enough to run the engine for warmth on the coldest nights without spending money she desperately needed for food. She kept a mental rotation of 3 or 4 different locations, unwilling to stay in any single spot long enough to draw attention from store employees or, worse, from anyone who might recognize her or the children. Baby Journey, only 14 months old during this stretch, required the most careful management, Tanya timing feedings and diaper changes around gas station stops with a precision she never knew she was capable of, warming bottles using hot water from station bathroom sinks when she could manage it, holding Journey through the coldest nights to keep her warm enough to sleep soundly. Micah, 4 years old, asked questions periodically that Tanya answered as gently and vaguely as she could manage, careful not to frighten him further than the situation already demanded. She worked double shifts at the diner whenever she could get them, leaving the older 2 children, Devontae and Kayla, responsible for watching Micah and baby Journey in the car during her shorter shifts, an arrangement that filled her with guilt every single time, but felt like the only option available given her circumstances. She showered at a gym she'd found a discounted day pass rate for, did laundry at a laundromat 2 nights a week, and kept the entire situation hidden from her own family and most of her friends, ashamed in a way she now recognizes as unfair to herself, but that felt, at the time, impossible to shake. Her only real confidant during those 6 weeks was Faye Whitmore, a fellow server at the diner who noticed, before almost anyone else, that something was seriously wrong. Catching Tanya changing Journey's diaper in the diner's employee bathroom before an early shift one morning and gently refusing to let the conversation end until Tanya told her the truth. Faye couldn't offer much materially, living paycheck to paycheck herself with 2 kids of her own, but she offered something Tanya needed almost as badly, a place to do laundry twice a week, and someone who knew the full truth and didn't judge her for it. It was on the 39th night of living in the car, a Thursday, that Tanya allowed herself the small indulgence of a $2 scratch ticket while paying for gas, a tiny act of hope she later described as almost embarrassing in how little she expected from it. She scratched it in the car after putting the kids down for the night, expecting nothing, and found herself staring at numbers that, once she'd verified them 3 separate times against her phone with hands shaking too hard to type steadily, represented a life-changing sum of money, considerably more than she'd ever imagined winning from anything in her entire life. She didn't wake the children. She sat in the driver's seat for nearly 2 hours that night, oscillating between disbelief and a kind of controlled panic about what to do next, understanding instinctively that she needed to move carefully rather than announce anything to anyone until she fully understood what she was actually holding. She called Faye first thing the next morning, and Faye, practical as ever even through her own shock, was the one who suggested Tanya contact a financial advisor before doing anything else, someone Faye's own aunt had used years earlier for a much smaller inheritance. Tanya remembered driving to the diner the following morning for her scheduled shift, going through the motions of a normal workday with a secret so enormous it felt almost physically heavy, unable to fully process what had happened even as she poured coffee and took orders with hands that hadn't quite stopped trembling since the night before. She called out sick the next day instead, the first day off she'd taken in months, needing the quiet space to simply sit with what was happening before she could function normally around anyone else. Tanya spent the following week moving carefully and quietly, verifying the ticket through proper channels, meeting briefly with a financial advisor who helped her understand the actual scope of what she'd won and the basic steps involved in claiming it responsibly, and arranging, The moment the funds were confirmed, for her and the children to move into a motel room considerably nicer than the back seat of her car had been, the first real bed any of them had slept in 6 weeks. She cried the first night in that motel room, watching all 4 kids sleep soundly for the first time in over a month, a release of 6 weeks of carefully controlled fear she'd been holding without any real outlet. Tanya moved quickly but deliberately over the following 2 months, securing a modest rental home in a good school district, re-enrolling all 4 children without disrupting their current school year any further than it already had been, and setting aside a meaningful portion of the winnings into accounts specifically earmarked for each child's future rather than spending impulsively on anything beyond what her family genuinely needed. She kept the win largely private, telling only her closest family members and Faye the actual details, understanding intuitively that this kind of news, once it spread, would change how people treated her in ways she wasn't yet ready to navigate. She spent considerable time during those 2 months simply learning how to make decisions again, without the constant background calculation of survival, a shift she found surprisingly disorienting after 6 weeks of measuring every choice against gas money and the nearest safe parking lot. Choosing a rental home felt almost overwhelming at first, Tanya second-guessing herself over decisions that would have seemed trivial before, uncertain how to trust a version of stability that felt, for the first several weeks, too fragile to fully believe in. The rental home itself became, over those first months, the first place in years that actually felt entirely safe. Tanya slowly watching her children settle into a version of normal life she hadn't been able to offer them for longer than she wanted to admit, even to herself. Devante, old enough to have absorbed more of the stress of the preceding years than Tanya initially realized, began sleeping through full nights again within weeks of the move, a small detail that brought Tanya to tears more than once when she noticed it. Kayla, 7 at the time, asked Tanya directly one evening, several weeks into their new home, whether they were going to have to leave again, a question that broke something open in Tanya she hadn't fully processed until her daughter voiced it out loud. She sat with Kayla for nearly an hour that night, explaining as honestly as she could manage for a child that age, that they were safe now, that this home was theirs to keep, watching relief settle slowly across her daughter's face in a way that steadied something in Tanya as much as it did in Kayla. Word of the win, despite Tanya's efforts at privacy, eventually spread through the small, tightly connected community where she'd grown up, filtering slowly through mutual acquaintances until it inevitably reached Corwin roughly 4 months after Tanya had first scratched that ticket. His first contact came as a casual, almost testing text message, checking in on the kids in a tone considerably warmer than anything Tanya had heard from him in the final year of their marriage, a message she read twice before deciding not to respond immediately. The messages continued over the following 2 weeks, growing steadily warmer and more insistent, Corwin mentioning missing the kids, missing her, describing vague plans to get things back on track, without ever quite naming the fact that he clearly now knew about the money. Tanya watched the pattern unfold with a mixture of exhaustion and a strange, detached clarity, recognizing exactly what was happening even as part of her, the part that had once genuinely loved this man and built a family with him, wanted badly to believe his sudden warmth was about anything other than what she suspected it actually was. Corwin showed up in person 3 weeks after the messages began, dressed considerably nicer than Tanya remembered him dressing in years, standing on the front porch of her new rental home asking, with what appeared to be genuine emotion, for a chance to talk, to see the kids, to explain how much he'd supposedly changed in the months since she'd left. Tanya stood in the doorway studying him for a long moment before agreeing to a brief conversation on the porch, unwilling to let him inside the home she'd built specifically to feel safe from exactly this kind of uncertainty. He talked, once they were seated on the porch steps, about regret, about therapy he claimed to have started, about missing the specific sound of the kids in the house, language that might have moved Tanya considerably more if it had arrived even 1 month before word of the lottery win had reached him rather than 3 weeks after. She listened to all of it without much visible reaction, watching him carefully for any acknowledgement of the 6 weeks she and the children had spent living in a car, any real accounting of the rent money he'd never explained, any evidence that his account of the marriage matched the one she'd actually lived through. He described, at one point, a version of their final year together that sounded, to Tanya's ear, almost unrecognizable, softened and reframed in ways that quietly erased his own role in most of what had actually gone wrong. He spoke of a rough patch, rather than a pattern of lost jobs and unexplained missing money, of getting overwhelmed sometimes, rather than a temper that had made his own children flinch, a version of events Tanya found herself almost fascinated by and how completely it avoided anything resembling real accountability. "Do you know where we were sleeping the night I won that ticket?" Tanya asked him, watching the question land somewhere he clearly hadn't prepared for. Corwin hesitated, offering a vague, uncomfortable answer about assuming she'd stayed with family, an answer that told Tanya, more clearly than almost anything else he could have said, exactly how little he'd actually thought about what happened to her and the children once she left, how easily he'd let himself believe whatever version of events required the least accountability from him. "We were in the car, Corwin," Tanya said, "for 6 weeks. Because you spent our rent money and wouldn't tell me on what, and because I was scared of what happened in that apartment when you got angry. The kids slept in a car in a gas station parking lot while you were wherever you were. And now you're on my porch talking about missing the sound of them in a house, 3 weeks after finding out I won money." He tried to argue that the timing was coincidental, that he'd been planning to reach out regardless, an explanation Tanya found almost insulting in how transparently it avoided the actual substance of what she'd just said. She let him finish before responding, her voice steady rather than raised, telling him plainly that she wasn't interested in punishing him out of bitterness, but that she also wasn't willing to reopen a door that had nearly cost her children their safety, especially now that the only thing that had visibly changed since he'd last seen them was her bank account. "I'm not trying to hurt you by saying no," Tanya told him. "I'm trying to protect the one thing that actually matters to me, which is making sure my kids never again have to wonder if they're safe. That has nothing to do with money, Corwin. It has to do with 6 years of watching you make everything about you and calling it a bad week." He asked her, before finally standing to leave, whether the answer would ever change, whether there was any version of time or effort on his part that might eventually earn a different response. Tanya considered the question honestly before answering, telling him she genuinely didn't know, that she wasn't interested in permanently closing every door, but that whatever door might eventually open again would have nothing to do with money and everything to do with years of consistency he hadn't yet shown her even once. Corwin left the porch that evening without the outcome he'd clearly hoped for, and Tanya spent that night talking things through carefully with Faye, who'd come by specifically to be present for her afterward, both women sitting on the back patio of the rental home, well into the evening processing everything Tanya had finally said out loud to him directly. Tanya didn't cut Corwin out of the children's lives entirely in the months that followed, understanding that decision belonged, in time, more to her children than to her alone, arranging instead a cautious, limited visitation schedule supervised initially through a family caseworker named Odessa Marsh, who helped Tanya think through what a healthy, appropriately boundaried relationship between Corwin and the kids might eventually look like without requiring Tanya herself to reopen any door to reconciliation. Odessa met with Tanya several times over the following months, helping her build a visitation structure that prioritized the children's emotional stability above anything else, gradually increasing supervised time as Corwin demonstrated, in small consistent ways, that he could show up reliably without the volatility that had once defined so much of family life. Tanya found the process slow and occasionally frustrating, wanting badly at times to simply shut the door entirely, though she trusted Odessa's guidance that her children would eventually benefit from having formed their own relationship with their father on carefully managed terms, rather than one shaped entirely by Tanya's own understandable caution. Devante, old enough to have real feelings of his own about his father, struggled visibly with the new arrangement at first, caught between missing the version of his father from his earliest childhood memories and remembering clearly enough the fear of the final years to feel conflicted about wanting him back in any capacity. Tanya made a point of never pushing her own feelings about Corwin onto her children, allowing each of them, as they grew older, to form their own understanding of their father at whatever pace felt right for them individually. She noticed, over the following year, small signs that Corwin was genuinely trying in at least some respects: consistent visitation attendance, more patience during supervised visits than she remembered from him during their marriage, small gestures toward the children that seemed less performative the longer they continued. She remained cautious rather than convinced, understanding that months of good behavior didn't erase years of instability, though she allowed herself, gradually, to feel slightly less braced for disappointment each time he showed up as scheduled. Tanya used a portion of her winnings, once the immediate crisis of stability had been addressed, to quietly support Faye through an unexpected medical expense for one of Faye's own children. A gesture Faye initially resisted accepting before finally relenting, the two women's friendship deepening considerably through both the crisis they'd shared and the stability that eventually followed it. Tanya credits Faye, still, as the single person who made those 6 weeks survivable, understanding clearly that money alone would never have been enough without someone willing to see the full truth of what she was going through and stay anyway. She also began, roughly a year after the win, quietly volunteering a portion of her time and resources at a local shelter that had once nearly become her own last resort during those 6 weeks, an organization she'd researched but never actually needed to use, donating both money and her own time, helping other mothers navigate the exact kind of crisis she'd once faced alone in a gas station parking lot. She found the work meaningful in a way she hadn't expected, a way of transforming the hardest stretch of her life into something that might make someone else's slightly more survivable. Tanya doesn't describe herself as lucky when people occasionally ask about her story now, careful to separate the genuine hardship of those 6 weeks from whatever came after it. She describes the win instead as something that gave her the resources to finally act on a decision she'd already made the night she packed that car, a decision that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with refusing to raise her children inside a version of family that required them to feel unsafe. She thinks often about the version of herself sitting in that driver's seat on the 39th night, certain in that moment that nothing about her circumstances would ever meaningfully change, and finds a kind of quiet gratitude in knowing that woman couldn't have imagined the life her children would eventually get to live. She keeps the original scratch ticket, verified and long since claimed, in a small frame in her bedroom, not as a trophy exactly, but as a reminder of exactly how close survival and transformation sat next to each other that particular night. She built, in the 2 years since, a life she describes simply as quiet and steady, watching her children thrive in a home where the only thing they have to wonder about anymore is what to have for dinner, not whether their parents are about to fight, and not whether tonight is a night they'll be sleeping in the car. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to Psyche Tales TV for more stories about the quiet strength it takes to protect your children even when the cost is enormous. And tell us in the comments whether you think Tanya should have given Corwin a real second chance, or whether her answer was exactly the right one. Before you go, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Take care of yourself. I'll see you in the next one.